On June 22, 1954, the peaceful quiet of a Christchurch park was shattered by the screams of two teenage girls. Their faces were wild with panic and their clothes were soaked in blood as they ran out of the bush, begging for help. According to the girls, one of their mothers had accidentally fallen and badly injured herself. When a local merchant ran to help, what he found was a scene that turned out to be anything but an accident. This is Monsters. Pauline Yvonne Parker was born on May 26, 1938 in Christchurch, New Zealand. She was the third child to her parents Herbert and Honora. Sadly, their first son was stillborn, which left her sister Wendy as the oldest. A couple of years after Pauline came a younger sister named Rosemary. Rosemary was born with Down syndrome, and at the age of 2 she was sent to live in a care institution not far from where the family lived. They visited her weekly and brought her home for special occasions. Herbert and Honora worked as house staff and gardeners at the University of Canterbury. Although they were not legally married, Honora used Herbert's last name instead of her maiden name, and everyone who knew them assumed they were husband and wife. At the time, it would have been considered highly unconventional to live together and raise children out of wedlock. During the war years, Pauline was diagnosed with osteomyelitis, which is a severe infection of the bones. The infections are incredibly difficult to treat, even with modern medicine. They also cause a lot of pain and require prolonged medical treatment. Pauline's infection became so bad that she needed an operation. After a 9-month stay in the hospital, she was able to return home but was left with a permanent limp and pain that excluded her from any kind of physical activity. Pauline's time in the hospital was incredibly lonely. She couldn't go to school and she lost touch with her friends. Since her parents were busy working, they could only visit in the evenings. To pass the time, she escaped into the pages of any books she could get her hands on. But after a while, even that wasn't enough to fill the void. With no one her age to talk to or play with, Pauline started retreating into her own imagination. In her personal journal, she began to document a fantasy world of her own making. The pages were filled with detailed plot lines and larger-than-life characters going on adventures she could only dream of. That imaginary world helped Pauline to pass the time and cope with the boredom and solitude of her hospital stay, but she still longed for a day when she could have a best friend out in the real world. Juliet Hulme was born in London on October 28, 1938, to her parents Henry and Hilda. Dr. Henry Hulme was a physicist who would later become a leader in Britain's atomic weapons research. As a child, Juliet was diagnosed with severe tuberculosis, which left her with chronic breathing problems. Her doctor recommended that the best thing her parents could do was send her away from the cold British climate to somewhere warmer. In 1945, not long after World War II ended, Juliet was sent to live with a foster family in the Bahamas in the hope that her symptoms would improve. 3 years later in 1948, Henry was invited to move to New Zealand to become the rector of the University of Canterbury. Not long after they arrived in the country, Juliet rejoined her parents and younger brother Jonathan, and they settled into their new life in Christchurch. Spending so much time away from her parents and children of her own age left Juliet feeling isolated and lonely, just like what Pauline had gone through during her hospitalization. No one seemed to understand her, and the only place she felt safe was within the limitless world of her own imagination. Before long, their imaginations would collide with horrific consequences. The girls were a few months apart in age and in the same year at Christchurch Girls' High School. From the moment they met, it was like a magnetic force was pulling them together. Their connection was so intense it seemed as though they had known each other forever, and they quickly became inseparable. At first, Juliet and Pauline were drawn together because of their shared understanding of the pain and solitude of their childhood illnesses. But it didn't take long for them to realize they shared something much deeper, a vivid imagination and a love for creating worlds far more exciting than their own. Both girls agreed that the only thing better than one imagination was two. They could see beyond the world as it was, and they began to create a universe all their own, complete with new identities and new families. Perhaps most importantly, their new world came with a guarantee that they would never be alone again. Pauline and Juliet promised each other that they would never let anything or anyone tear them apart. The girls called their imagined utopia the Fourth World. It was centered around the kingdom of Barovnia, which was a place with no rules and where life revolved around art, music, and beauty. They assigned themselves royal titles, with Pauline becoming Gina and Juliet taking on the name Deborah. At first glance, it seemed exactly like the kind of fantasy you'd expect from two teenage girls. In Pauline's diary, she shared the exhilaration she felt when she was immersed in their shared world. On April 3, 1953, which was also Good Friday, she wrote, quote, "Today Juliet and I found the key to the fourth world. We realize now that we have had it in our possession for about 6 months, but we only realized it on the day of the death of Christ. We saw a gateway through the clouds. We sat on the edge of the path and looked down the hill out over the bay. The island looked beautiful. The sea was blue. Everything was full of peace and bliss. We then realized we had the key. We now know that we are not genii as we thought. We have an extra part of our brain which can appreciate the fourth world. Only about 10 people have it. When we die, we will go to the fourth world. But meanwhile, on 2 days every year, we may use the key to look into that beautiful world which we have been lucky enough to be allowed to know of, on this day of finding the key to the way through the clouds." After hearing that diary entry, it would be easy to think that Pauline and Juliet's fantasy world was influenced by religion in some way. Neither of their families were particularly religious, and a diary entry written by Pauline a few months after that one stated that, quote, "Juliet and I decided the Christian religion had become too much of a farce and we decided to make up one of our own." In another entry, she compared Barovnia to heaven by saying the fourth world was, quote, "better than heaven because there weren't any Christians." Other entries were far more whimsical and less specific, like this one from 1954 which read, quote, "Both sets of eyes, though different far, hold many mysteries strange. Impassively they watch the race of man decay and change. Hatred burning bright in the brown eyes with enemies for fuel. Icy scorn glitters in the gray skies, contemptuous and cruel." Pauline and Juliet spent every spare minute talking about the fourth world. During classes, they would pass notes about new characters, and on the weekends they would race through their chores so they could meet together and come up with new plot lines for their royal namesakes. The girls' parents knew they were close, and for a while they were supportive of the relationship. Pauline's mother, Honora, was basically relieved that her daughter had been able to make a new friend after spending so much time away from school during her hospitalization. When Juliet's family decided to go away on a holiday to Port Levy and invited Pauline to join them, both girls were thrilled. It was an opportunity for them to spend uninterrupted time together and indulge in their fantasy without the usual boundaries of school and home life. During the trip, they spoke about Barovnia from the minute they woke up to the minute they went to sleep. They discussed new characters and elaborate plot lines as though they were talking about real events, and even mentioned names of their fictional characters to Juliet's parents as if they were real people. One of Pauline's diary entries from the trip stated, quote, "The days I spent at Port Levy were the most heavenly ones I have ever experienced. Mrs. Hulme did my hair. She calls me her foster daughter. Mrs. Hulme says she wished I was her daughter too." It was around that time that Juliet's parents began to realize that the relationship had gone beyond typical teenage friendship. By then, Pauline had begun to spend more time at Juliet's home than her own. She would often stay over there for 3 or 4 days at a time, and they would lock themselves away, only coming out for meal times. Whenever Pauline returned home, Juliet would become distressed and faint, and she wouldn't improve until Pauline came back. Eventually, Henry and Hilda discussed their concerns with Pauline's parents, who agreed that the girls' dependence on each other was unusual. But before they could make any plans to keep the girls apart, Juliet was hospitalized with tuberculosis. Pauline's diary entry from that day said, quote, "Mrs. Hulme told me that they found out today that Juliet has tuberculosis in one lung. Poor Julietta. It is only now that I realize how fond I am of her. I nearly fainted when I heard. I had a terrible job not to cry. It would be wonderful if I could get tuberculosis too." The next day, Pauline was allowed to visit Juliet in the hospital, and she wrote, quote, "I spent a wretched night. It was a relief to see Juliet looking so well. We agreed it was a great pity I had not tuberculosis too, and it would be wonderful if I could catch it. We would be in the sanatorium together and would be able to write a lot. We have decided we are the most incredible optimists." That was the only time Pauline was allowed to visit Juliet in the hospital. Their families thought it would be a good thing for them to spend some time apart in the hopes that it would help them move past their obsession. And Juliet's parents were worried that Pauline's visits would be more harmful than helpful to her recovery. But being separated seemed to have the opposite effect than what the parents had anticipated. When Pauline realized her parents were trying to keep them apart, the entries about the fourth world began to take a darker tone. A new plotline emerged, revolving around her royal character in Borovnia and the hatred she had for her mother, who was trying to keep her away from her prince. When Juliet returned home after 3 months in the hospital, Pauline wrote, quote, "It was wonderful returning with Juliet. It was as if she had never been away. I believe I could fall in love with Juliet." After that, Pauline's entries became fixated on the idea that she was being kept apart from Juliet. She wrote about resenting the mundane reality of her life and her hatred of anyone who stood between her and Juliet spending time together. When their parents refused to let them see each other, they began sneaking out at night to meet in the park. Pauline's parents soon discovered what she was up to, and they took her to see a psychiatrist about the level of codependence she seemed to have with Juliet. He said he suspected the girls were having a homosexual relationship and that they would soon grow out of it, a suggestion that was not unusual for the time. The sexual aspect of this case is highly contested. Pauline's diary entries reveal a deep, almost obsessive love for Juliet. She often mentions that they bathed together and slept in the same bed. In several entries, she said they stayed up all night acting out sex scenes between their royal characters and their lovers from the fourth world. But there's no specific mention of a physical relationship between them. At the time, homosexuality was regarded as a mental illness, which may have influenced what she wrote and even her own perspective on her feelings. But Pauline also wrote about sneaking out at night to meet with boys and losing her virginity to a boarder who was staying at their house. Pauline's diary documented her frustration that Honora was stopping her and Juliet being together. Pauline and Honora had never been particularly close, and her diary often mentioned feelings of resentment and tension between them. Pauline would refer to her mother as dull and unimaginative, and someone who couldn't possibly understand the brilliance of the fourth world or a friendship like what she had with Juliet. She wrote about how her mother would insist on her doing extra chores or schoolwork just so she couldn't spend time in her fantasy world or with Juliet. She would write, quote, "Why could not mother die? Dozens of people are dying all the time, thousands, so why not mother and father too? Life is very hard." Yeah, life is so hard for a teenager with living parents. At the same time, the diary entries about Borovnia showed a transition from a place of peace and beauty to a violent, bloodthirsty place filled with conflict between the characters. What had once been a wonderland of parties, love stories, and opulence became filled with storylines about highway robberies and the violent deaths of their once beloved characters. There were elaborate descriptions of battles, executions, and revenge plots, particularly between Gina and her mother. And where the girls had once seemed content with living in royal bliss, they began to talk about an entirely new profession in their alternative world. A diary entry laid out the details, saying, quote, "We worked out how much prostitutes would earn and how much we would make in such a profession. We have spent a really wonderful day messing around and talking over how much fun we will have in our profession. We have worked out some glorious plans and worked out a whole new family for our future." The girls also began to speak of themselves as superior, not only because of their imagined royal titles, but also because they were supremely intelligent. They wrote things like, quote, "We are so brilliantly clever. The world is not wide enough for us, and we have decided how sad it is for other people that they cannot appreciate our genius." Without a trigger, that fantasy world and all of its attachments might have continued on as simply that, a fantasy. Maybe in time their feelings would have faded and they would have moved on to other interests, like most teenage obsessions eventually do. But that trigger was brewing in the background, and that time it threatened to pull the girls apart forever. Since arriving in Christchurch, Juliet's parents, Henry and Hilda, had opened their home to boarders. Most of those men were students at the university where Henry worked. In the middle of 1954, Juliet and Pauline discovered that Hilda was having an affair with one of the lodgers. At around the same time the affair came out, Henry was forced to resign from his position due to problems at the university. Within a couple of months, Henry and Hilda announced that they were getting a divorce, and Henry decided he was going to return to England. Hilda planned to stay in New Zealand and start a new life with her lover. As for Juliet, well, she wasn't going with either of her parents. No, they planned on sending her to live with extended family in South Africa. Obviously, that news was devastating to Juliet. She had only been in New Zealand for 5 years, and she didn't want to give her whole life up, especially when she had no say in it. Most of all, she didn't want to leave Pauline. After all, they had promised that no one and nothing would ever tear them apart. To Juliet, the thought of leaving Pauline behind was simply unbearable. When Pauline found out Juliet was leaving, she was equally devastated. Losing Juliet meant losing the one person who understood her frustrations with the world outside their fantasy land and the one person who made her feel extraordinary. The girls became consumed by the idea that they couldn't let themselves be separated, no matter what it took. Pauline wrote, quote, "Such a huge amount has happened, we don't know where we are. But one thing Deborah and I are sticking to through thick or thin. We sink or swim together." Within days, they had come up with the perfect solution to their problem. Pauline would simply move with Juliet to South Africa. After a couple of months, they would travel to Hollywood to fulfill their dreams of turning the novels they had written about the Fourth World into movies, starring themselves as the leading actresses, of course. By then, they had written 6 full-length books as well as plays, poetry, and an opera, all based around the characters of Barovnia. Pauline and Juliet were convinced their parents would be supportive of the idea. Now, you probably won't be surprised to find out that their reaction was the complete opposite, and they told the girls there was no chance of them staying together. Honora was particularly disapproving because of how concerned she had become about the girls' dependence on each other. If anything, the parents all seemed relieved that there would soon be oceans separating Pauline and Juliet. When their first suggestion didn't work, the girls came up with a plan to ensure they never had to be apart again. Pauline asked her parents if she could stay at Juliet's home for 2 weeks until she left on the boat to South Africa. All of the parents had spent the prior few months trying to limit the amount of time the girls spent together, but they conceded it might help them say their goodbyes and come to terms with their separation. After all, how much harm could 2 teenage girls do? A lot. They could do a lot of harm. And they did. During those 2 weeks, Pauline wrote in her diary every day. Most of her entries sounded like this, quote, "Anger against mother boiled up inside of me, as it is she who is one of the main obstacles in my path. Suddenly a means of ridding myself of this obstacle occurred to me. if she were to die. Other entries read, quote, "She is the only thing that stands in our way. We have decided that her removal is the only solution." The girls spent hours discussing that the only logical way to guarantee they could be together was to get rid of Honora, permanently. With her out of the picture, Pauline's father, Herbert, would have no choice but to send her to live with Juliet in South Africa. Once they were free of their tyrannical parents, they could move together to Tinseltown and become stars. On June 22, 1954, Pauline wrote an entry in her diary titled "The Day of the Happy Event." That afternoon, Honora took Juliet and Pauline to Victoria Park, which is located in the Port Hills Range area of Christchurch. Juliet was set to leave New Zealand a couple of days later, and they told Honora that they wanted to spend the afternoon together to say a final goodbye. At around 3 p.m., the trio sat down for a cup of tea at a small kiosk in the park. When they finished their drinks, they walked into the bush along a steep section of path that led towards a small wooden bridge. Less than 30 minutes later, the girls emerged from the bush covered in blood. Their faces were twisted in panic and they were screaming for help. "Please help us, Mummy is hurt, covered in blood." The tea shop owners recognized the girls and ran towards them asking what had happened. They said that Honora had fallen and hit her head on the bridge and she was covered in blood. The police were called while the owner of the tea kiosk headed down the path to see if he could offer any help to the injured woman. 426 feet or 130 meters down the track on a flattish area, he discovered the body of Honora partially concealed next to the path. When he stepped closer, he immediately sensed that it was not the case of a woman falling over and hitting her head. It was clear that something far more sinister had happened. The woman was laying in an awkward position on her back with her feet facing up the hill and her head on the downhill side. She was covered in blood and her face was swollen beyond recognition. Her skirt was pulled up above her knees and one of her shoes was laying a few feet away from the body. The man pulled Honora's skirt down in what he would later call an act of decency, a small effort to give her some dignity in the face of the shocking violence of the scene. A few minutes later, a police officer arrived at the location. He checked for signs of life, and when he found none, he called a doctor to pronounce the woman dead. The physician's report observed that the victim's head was thrown back and she was lying at a downward angle. He also noticed a lower denture plate which was lying on the ground next to the body. She had been beaten so badly her teeth were literally knocked from her mouth. The woman was wearing stockings which were smeared with mud and blood. Her eyes were blackened and swollen shut and she had severe gashes on her head. Gravity had caused the blood from her wounds to trickle down the hill and congeal in the mud and dirt. He noted that there was so much blood, it indicated the victim had been exsanguinated. In other words, her body had been completely drained of blood. His initial assessment was that her carotid artery had been severed during the attack, along with immense blood loss from the wounds on her head. The physician was clear that those injuries could not have been caused by a fall. The woman had been violently attacked and murdered. The first sergeant to arrive on the scene took detailed notes of what he saw. He took measurements showing that the blood had flowed more than 10 feet or 3.8 meters down the hill from the body. Less than 15 inches or 38 centimeters away from where Honora was found, he discovered half of a brick and an empty woman's stocking. Both were completely covered in blood. When the medical examiner arrived around 7:30 p.m., he noted that rigor mortis had not set in yet. The body had 45 discernible injuries, which were mostly concentrated on the head, neck, face, and hands. 24 of those wounds were severe lacerations to the head and face. Some of the wounds were minor, but many were extensive. The wounds had a unique characteristic in that they had ragged edges and there were signs of crushing. That finding was consistent with blows from a blunt instrument which had been used with significant force. The front of Honora's skull had extensive fractures and she had multiple brain hemorrhages. That indicated that Honora's head had been immobilized and had stayed in one place on the ground during the attack. According to the medical examiner, she would have become unconscious after just a couple of those blows. That meant that even once she was unable to fight back, the attacker had continued to hit her over the head as she lay on the ground. Bruises on Honora's neck indicated that she had been forcibly held down, but there was no evidence of strangulation. The ME also found lacerations on her fingers, which indicated that she had attempted to defend herself until she became unconscious. The brick and stocking were sent for forensic examination, which in those days didn't include DNA analysis or detailed microscopic fiber comparisons. But the blood type on the items matched Honora, and hairs which were found on the stocking also matched samples collected from her scalp. The tests confirmed the theory that Honora's killer or killers had placed the brick inside the stocking and used it to hit her over the head. At some point, the force of the blows caused the stocking to rip and the brick was ejected. The blood stains on the brick indicated it was then used by hand to continue the attack until she died. Ultimately, Honora's cause of death was determined to be shock associated with multiple wounds of the head and fractures of the skull. It was clear that the woman had not been injured in an accident. She had been murdered. So the investigation immediately turned to the last people who were seen with her, Juliet and Pauline. By the time officers left the scene to speak to the two girls, they had returned to Juliet's home. Her parents weren't clear about what exactly had happened at the park. All they knew was that the girls had been there with Honora. At some point, she had taken a bad fall and they had gone for help. Despite the girls being covered in blood and having witnessed something so terrible, they were extremely calm. They didn't say much as their clothes were removed and packaged up for collection by the local dry cleaners or when they showered and got dressed into pairs of Juliet's pajamas. It was only when Herbert turned on the radio to try to break up the tension that Juliet began talking. And talking. And talking. She seemed keen to talk about anything and everything, except what had happened at the park. Both girls refused to answer any questions about what had happened. After dinner, they went to Juliet's bedroom and she began to recite all of her favorite poems out loud, one after the other, until she couldn't keep her eyes open any longer. By the time Herbert checked on them a few minutes later, both of the girls had drifted off to sleep. Less than an hour later, two police officers knocked on the door of the home hoping to speak to the girls. Juliet's parents were reluctant to wake them, but the officers insisted. They were woken up and taken downstairs for their first police interview. The girls took a seat next to each other on the couch, and the officers began asking them questions. They were calm and collected as they shared how they had gone for tea at the park together. They had walked down the path along a familiar route when suddenly Honora had slipped and hit her head, which caused her to bleed a lot. The girls had tried to help her, but she wasn't answering them, so they ran back to the tea shop for help. Throughout the interview, both Juliet and Pauline were composed and articulate. Even though Honora's death had occurred just a few hours earlier, the officers knew that her injuries couldn't be explained away by an accident. So they asked the girls to tell them once again what had happened. That time, Juliet's story was slightly different than before. In the second version of events, Juliet said that she heard Pauline and Honora fighting in the woods. She couldn't see them while they were yelling, but when she came around the corner, she realized that Honora had fallen and hit her head. Pauline backed up Juliet's new version of events and said that Juliet hadn't been there when she was fighting with her mother. But the story still didn't make sense. After all, the interview had taken place while the girls were together, so of course they could say whatever they wanted and the other would back it up. By the end of the interview, the officers knew there was more to the story and they felt there was only one way they could find out what had really happened, and that was to talk to the girls separately. They told Pauline to get dressed, and then they drove her to the police station for further questioning. Officers also picked up her father from their home where he was trying to come to terms with his wife's death. At the same time, officers carried out a search of Pauline's bedroom. Inside, they found her personal diary and the countless pages of entries planning the execution of her own mother. The diary revealed the exact steps she and Juliet intended to take to eliminate Honora from their lives for good. There was a description of how they planned to make her death look like an accident so that they didn't have to go to prison, and even a list of possible weapons they could use in the attack. Eventually, they decided on a brick and a stocking because it was easy to get their hands on. The following day, Pauline and Juliet were arrested and charged with murder. Their trial began at the Christchurch Supreme Court just 2 months after Honora's murder. At the time, Pauline was 16 years old and Juliet was 15 years old, making them two of the youngest people in New Zealand's history to stand trial for murder. There was intense public interest in the case, mostly due to the girls' ages and the fact that they came from middle-class educated backgrounds, not to mention the sheer brutality of the incident itself. The trial quickly became a public spectacle. Each day the courtroom was filled to capacity with people hoping to catch a glimpse of the two monsters who came in the shape of seemingly normal teenage girls. The crime made headline news around the world, particularly in the United Kingdom, thanks to Juliet's father's reputation in the scientific field. When the girls were asked how they pleaded to the charge of murder, they both replied not guilty. The prosecution was led by Crown Prosecutor Alan Brown. He opened his case by stating that, quote, "The evidence will make it terribly clear that these two young accused conspired together to kill the mother of one of them and horribly carried their plan into effect. The two girls, it was discovered, were planning to go to the United States to have their novels published and had been trying by various means to acquire the money for their fares. The plan apparently was put out of their heads, and it was arranged that the girl Hulme should go with her father as far as South Africa. The girl Parker wanted to go with her, and the girl Hulme wanted Parker to accompany them. Both girls were determined not to be parted, and they knew that Mrs. Parker would object to their going away together. They decided that the best way to end Mrs. Parker's objections was to kill her in such a manner as to make her death appear to be an accident. The prosecutor called the co-accused precocious and dirty-minded girls. He discussed how Pauline's diary and her chilling entries would prove beyond a doubt that the murder was a premeditated act which had been planned and carried out by the two girls. He emphasized that neither of them was more responsible than the other, and even though the diary entries had been written solely by Pauline, they were both equally culpable. When it came time to show the jury the evidence gathered from those pages, he pointed to an entry from June 19th, 3 days before the murder. In it, Pauline wrote, quote, "We practically finished our books today, and our main idea for the day was to moiter Mother. This notion is not a new one, but this time it is a definite plan which we intend to carry out. We have worked it out carefully and are both thrilled by the idea. Naturally, we feel a trifle nervous, but the pleasure of anticipation is great. I shall not write the plan down here as I shall write it up when we carry it out, I hope." It seemed that Pauline used the word moiter, M-O-I-D-E-R, in her diary instead of the word murder, but it was clear what she was talking about. 2 days later, she continued, quote, "Deborah rang and we decided to use a rock and a stocking rather than a sandbag. We discussed the moiter fully. We feel very keyed up, as though I were planning a surprise party. Mother has fallen in with everything beautifully, and the happy event is to take place tomorrow afternoon. So next time I write in this diary, Mother will be dead. How odd, yet how pleasing." On the morning of Honora's death, Pauline wrote her final entry, quote, "I felt very excited and, the night before Christmas-ish last night." She's referring to the excitement of killing her mother as if she was waiting for a present on Christmas morning. Detective Inspector Caudle was the lead investigator on the case. He recounted his initial interviews with the girls and how calm and collected they appeared when he spoke to them. They mimicked each other and waited for the other to speak before agreeing and concurring with whatever they said. When he separated them, they became distressed and panicked and frequently asked about the other. As far as evidence, the bloodied brick and stocking which had been used to beat Honora to death was presented to the jury. The blood and hair found on the items connected them to Honora, and medical specialists confirmed that her injuries matched the weapon. The prosecution knew that the most likely angle the defense would take was to claim the girls were mentally unwell or insane at the time of the murder. So they called on psychiatric experts who testified that, even though the girls shared an intense and unusual bond, they were fully aware of the gravity of their actions and therefore knew that what they planned to do was wrong. A senior medical advisor at the Avondale Mental Hospital in Auckland assessed Juliet and Pauline and provided the following report. Quote, "In all my experience and reading, I have no knowledge of two insane persons combining to commit a crime. They knew what they were doing was wrong. In the diaries, there was evidence of motive, planning, and premeditation. Both were intelligent, and neither had delusions nor suffered from paranoia. The two accused play-acted and had fantasies, but I do not think they are any evidence of insanity. These girls were well aware of the differences between their fantasies and reality. They assured me they were always able to come back to Earth when they had to or wanted to. I do not consider that homosexuality is any indication of insanity whatsoever, or that it has any relationship with insanity." In other words, the girls were extremely imaginative, and some of those imaginations were troubling, but they also knew the difference between right and wrong. In one of Juliet's interviews, she stated, quote, "I would have to be an absolute moron to not know murder was against the law." It's important to note that in one of Juliet's police interviews, she denied any sexual relationship with Pauline and said, quote, "How could we? We are both women." As expected, the defense pursued an insanity plea. They never disputed that Pauline and Juliet were the ones who beat Honora to death with a brick inside a stocking, but they argued that they did so because they were insane. Except it was no stock standard insanity defense. They asserted that the girls were delusional and paranoid because of their homosexuality. They added that that particular type of psychosis made them appear perfectly normal until they were in each other's presence, which is when they would become jointly insane. In modern terms, that's referred to as Folie, Deux, which is a rare condition where two people share the same delusional beliefs. According to the defense, that made the girls incapable of understanding the moral consequences of their actions. Their obsession with their fantasy world had blurred the line between reality and imagination, which made them believe that committing murder was acceptable. Their lawyer said, quote, "These girls are mentally ill, sick adolescents, not brutal criminals." Pauline's diary entries were used in their defense in much the same way they had been used against them by the prosecution. Just a few days before the murder, Pauline had written, quote, "We were discussing at first how we sometimes had a strange feeling that we had done what we were doing before. We realized why this was, and why Deborah and I have such extraordinary telepathy, and why people treat us and look at us the way they do, and why we behave as we do. It's because we are mad. We are both stark, staring, raving mad. There is definitely no doubt about it, and we are thrilled by the thought." The defense also presented evidence of Pauline and Juliet's strange behavior since being taken into custody after the murder. During the first few days of their imprisonment, both had spent long periods of time yelling, screaming, throwing things, and rocking in the corner. But after a couple of days, they became much more subdued. In one of Juliet's interviews with a psychiatrist, she said she was going to rewrite the Bible. The defense presented those stories as proof that the girls were insane. The defense also commissioned their own experts to examine the girls, and, wouldn't you know it, those experts determined that both were certifiably insane. They pointed to the extreme level of imagination the girls had put into building their make-believe world, which proved they were unable to separate fantasy from reality. When their perception of reality was threatened by Honora not letting Pauline travel overseas with Juliet, they took the only action they could by removing that obstacle, permanently. One expert said, quote, "They thought that they were transferring an unhappy woman to heaven and preserving at the same time the association that was essential to their paranoid delusions of grandeur. They did not regard their act as morally wrong." According to the defense experts, the fact that Juliet and Pauline were clearly insane also explained why they never showed any remorse for their actions and why they didn't seem to comprehend the seriousness of what they had done. During the court proceedings, Pauline and Juliet often smiled or appeared bored and fidgety. They would look over at each other, giggle or flutter their eyelashes as if they were playing on the school ground, rather than sitting in the dock accused of murder. The murder trial lasted just 5 days. After less than a day of deliberation, the jury found Juliet Hulme and Pauline Parker guilty of murder. Due to their ages, they were unable to be considered for the death penalty, which was legal in New Zealand at the time. It would be abolished 7 years later in 1961. When it came time for sentencing, it wasn't a jury or even a judge who decided the girl's fate. Instead, the court handed responsibility over to a parliament and the Minister of Justice. That was a rare and highly political move. The brutality of the crime and the fact the murderers were teenage girls had shocked the world, and the legal system seemed uncertain about how to proceed with their sentencing. The case was discussed in Parliament, and eventually they were each sentenced to 5 years in prison. Juliet was sent to a women's prison in Mount Eden in Auckland to serve her sentence. At the time, she was the only child inmate, and she spent her first 3 months in solitary confinement. Pauline served her sentence in Christchurch. After 5 years, both women were released with a strict warning to never contact each other again. Juliet's release was unconditional, which meant she was free to leave the country as soon as her sentence was over. A few days after her release, she traveled to Italy to reunite with her father. Pauline was released on 6 months of parole in New Zealand. When her probationary period was over, she also left the country. The last time that Pauline and Juliet were alone together was on the evening of the murder, before the police arrived. It's ironic that they murdered someone so they could be together, only to be apart forever because of that same murder. In 1994, Sir Peter Jackson announced that he was going to direct a biographical film about the Parker Hulme murder as it had come to be known. He's the same director who brought us the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies, King Kong, and District 9. Kate Winslet starred as Juliet Hulme in what would become her breakout role, while Melanie Lynskey played Pauline Parker. It debuted at the Venice Film Festival in 1994 and was awarded the coveted Silver Lion before becoming one of the best-reviewed films of the year. The following year, Peter Jackson received his first ever Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay alongside his wife Dame Fran Walsh, who co-wrote Heavenly Creatures. By the time the film was released, the media tracked both women down to their new lives, and they wasted no time letting the public know exactly where the pair ended up. When Juliet left New Zealand, she took on a new identity as Anne Perry. After staying with her father, she moved in with her mother, who had since moved to London. Juliet worked as a flight attendant, then in retail sales, and then as an insurance underwriter. When city life didn't work out, she moved to a small Scottish fishing village named Port Mahomack. From there, she set out on the second most defining journey of her life, becoming the famous novelist she had always aspired to be. In 1979, she published her first book, The Cater Street Hangman, which was released under her assumed name. That book became a bestseller, and over the next 44 years, she published 50 crime novels which sold more than 25 million copies. She was awarded several prestigious writing awards and was named the Times of London's 100 Masters of Crime Writing alongside Agatha Christie and Arthur Conan Doyle. Juliet also defied her teenage declarations against religion and joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She also employed her brother Jonathan as her lead researcher and assistant. Up until 1994, nobody knew who the renowned crime novelist Anne Perry really was. But when reporters discovered her leading role in a gruesome murder nearly 40 years earlier, it wasn't a stretch to understand why she had become such a great crime novelist. When Juliet was asked to make a comment about her connection to the murder, she claimed to have blacked out the details of the day itself, but she admitted to her role in the killing of Honora Parker. She said she only went along with it because Pauline threatened to harm herself if she didn't. She spoke about her time in prison, saying, quote, I was guilty and it was the right place for me to be. She said that even though she and Pauline had been obsessed with each other, they did not have a sexual relationship and they were not lesbians. When she was asked if she was a good person, she said, quote, "In a sense, it's not a matter, at the end, of judging. I did this much good and that much bad. Which is greater? It's in the end, who am I? Am I somebody that can be trusted? Am I somebody that is compassionate, gentle, patient, strong? If you're that kind of person, if you've done something bad in the past, you've obviously changed. It's who you are when time's up that matters." Pauline also took on a new identity when she left prison. She chose the name Hillary Nathan, and after finishing 6 months of parole, she enrolled to study a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Auckland. She graduated in 1964 and spent a year working at the New Zealand Library School. Her colleagues there described her as mysterious and secretive, and that she was always absent on the day of the class photo. In 1965, Pauline packed up what little she owned and moved to London. She worked for a while at a library, but eventually she too decided the city wasn't for her. Then she moved to Kent, which is a quiet rural village in the southeast of England. Despite it being about as far away as you can get from Portahomac while still being on the same landmass, some still think it's eerily close to where her old best friend ended up. Pauline became a children's horse riding instructor and was known as a recluse in her small town. Like Juliet, she joined organized religion, although she chose to become a Roman Catholic. To date, Pauline has never made a public statement about her role in the murder of her mother, but her sister Wendy has. Pauline and Wendy are just 11 months apart in age, and despite Pauline's decision to murder their mother, the sisters kept in touch over the years. In 1997, Wendy told a reporter that Pauline was very remorseful for what she had done and had spent the next 40 years trying to make up for it. When she first moved to England, Pauline had tried to become a nun, but she was rejected. When that didn't work out, she moved to the village of Hoe in Kent and became, quote, "a nun in her own way. She's living in solitude. She's deeply religious. She leads a very unusual existence. She hasn't got a TV or a radio, so she would never have heard what Anne Perry had to say and she wouldn't care. She doesn't have any contact with the outside world. She's a reclusive, really. She's a devout Roman Catholic and spends much of her time in prayer." Wendy had come to terms with not only her mother's murder, but also the fact that her little sister was responsible. She doesn't believe Pauline was insane at the time, just that her hatred towards Honora grew out of proportion and that Pauline didn't comprehend the finality of death. Wendy said, quote, "After it happened, she was very sorry about it. It took her about 5 years to realize what she had done." Wendy agreed with Juliet's comments that there was nothing sexual about the girls' relationship, only that they were obsessed and codependent of each other. Neither Pauline or Juliet ever married or had children of their own. Juliet died on April 10, 2023 at the age of 84. In another twist of fate, she was visiting Los Angeles at the time to explore opportunities for one of her books to be made into a movie. Pauline and Juliet took bringing fantasy into reality to a whole new level and became monsters of their own making. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.